That's the issue here in the United States. Will we develop a political force that can successfully explain to the American working class what their problem is? Or will we continue to be governed by a Republican Party that blames immigrants more than Chinese, and a Democratic Party that blames Chinese more than immigrants? Neoliberalism, roughly from the 1970s to perhaps 2015, or some rough time like that, 30, 40, 45 years, that policy, neoliberalism, often referred to as globalization, was a policy in which the governments of Western Europe and North America and Japan eagerly supported a global free trade, no tariffs, minimum government intervention in the economy, support for corporations that relocated their business out of the country, internationalization. Governments told the people, you will be better off with free trade. Your standard of living will rise. Your job opportunities will improve. This was incorrect. It was bad economics then, but it was a very good rationale for what corporations in the West wanted to do. They wanted to go to China, India, Brazil, and so on to take advantage of the low wages and the growing market. And in order to do that, they had to overcome the nationalism that was still a strong tendency in these countries. So what happened was the neoliberal promise turned out to be half true, half false. The true part is it made huge profits. It was a successful program for increasing the profits of Western corporations. They could pay much lower wages in China and India than they paid where they came from. And they had the growing Chinese market and the growing Asian market. And so they had tremendous profits. That's why you saw a boom in the stock market in the West, because it was the only institution where you could see the profits producing rising wealth. But I like to remind people that in the United States, the richest 10% of our people own 80% of the shares on the stock market. So successful profiteering is only good for the top 10%, not for the masses. Meanwhile, for the masses, it was very bad. Millions of jobs working in manufacturing disappeared in the United States. Whole states out of the 50 states in the United States, whole states basically collapsed economically. Their industries disappeared, their jobs disappeared, their unions lost membership, they were forced to become low-wage service economies that they had not been before. It has been a trauma, a political, ideological trauma. And over those 40 years, I'll give you one example. In 1970, presidents from around the world, if they visited the United States, were taken to the city of Detroit. The city of Detroit was the center of the automobile industry in this country. Ford, General Motors, all of that. And it was a booming city. It had 2 million, which was very big then, 2 million people, a very successful labor union, the United Auto Workers, and all of that. Today, Detroit is a disaster. Its population has dropped from 2 million in 1970 to 700,000 today. That means that more than half the people in that powerful, successful city are gone. It is now a city 1/3 of abandoned housing. No one lives there. No one can afford to live there because there are no jobs. So that's an extreme example. But other large cities in the United States, Cleveland, Wilmington, Delaware, parts of Chicago have similar, Buffalo, New York, have similar histories. And it is for the mass of people, it has been a very difficult time. And so they are the losers of neoliberalism, but they are also the vast majority. And it was only a matter of time before an opportunistic politician would begin to see opportunity in speaking to the millions of people who had been hurt by neoliberalism because it was a boon for the profiteers, but not for the mass of people. That's our politics today. Mr. Trump simply rides on the wave of hostility to what has happened to the United States.
We are now making it clear to China that after years of targeting our industries and stealing our intellectual property, the theft of American jobs and wealth has come to an end.
They don't understand, because very few people teach it here, how to understand the world economy shifting. What they know is that their position in large parts of the United States are gone. The future for their children is not looking good. The prices, we've had an inflation here. The cost of higher education is out of reach. You cannot get a college education without taking on huge amounts of personal debt, you or your parents or your family. It's a whole new world here. And for the mass of the working class, not a good one. So what we have is a massive turning away from neoliberalism and globalization, except at the level of big business. Our corporate sector remains interested in neoliberalism and globalization because they have invested huge amounts of money in China, for example, in India and Brazil. They don't want to lose those investments. That's very important to them. So they support the Democratic Party and Mr. Biden, hoping to keep that. But the mass of the working class is not supportive of this kind of program, and they are turning more and more nationalistic. Even Mr. Biden has had to impose tariffs, for example. Mr. Trump began it between 2016 and 2020, and Mr. Biden, who wanted to get rid of it, could not. He had to stay in power, he had to become at least publicly nationalistic, put heavy tariffs against, above all, China. Millions of Americans who have been the losers of neoliberal globalization for decades. They are very unhappy. And the political leaders in the United States, desperate not to be blamed for all of this, have needed to come up with scapegoats. They have needed to come up with an explanation for the mass of people that blames somebody other than the corporations and the political apparatus that they own in this country. So they've come up with two major scapegoats. One of them is immigration. They have gotten Americans to believe that the immigrants, particularly those that come from the South, come up through Mexico into the United States, that they are the cause of the problems of the American working class. They have spent enormous amounts of time and energy and lots of money trying to make that case. And they've had to spend money and time because the case is ridiculous and silly. The United States is an advanced economy of 330 million people. The total number of undocumented immigrants in the United States is maybe 10 million. Okay? 10 million immigrants, 330 million Americans. There is no explanation of the difficulty for the economy as a whole that can be blamed on those 10 million people, especially when you remember they are among the poorest people in the world, these immigrants. They come with nothing. They are men, women, and children with no money, barely able to put a shirt on their body to keep warm. Okay? So this is outrageous, but it's the number one scapegoat. The number two scapegoat is China. And here you should understand also American political history. There are still many people who don't understand that the Cold War with the USSR is over. They still think of socialism and communism as frightening, foreign, evil phenomena. They do. And so because China is led by a communist party, it's very easy politically in the United States to say that China is an enemy. The real issue is the competition. Americans are now dealing with the fact that the Chinese produce the highest quality electric vehicle at the lowest price. Most Americans believe that the economic competition coming from China is intended to displace the dominant position of the world so that it's no longer American, it becomes Chinese. It's an evil plot to rule the world. This is how it is explained. And all kinds of people, including significant numbers of intellectuals, believe this. They don't know much about China. They don't know much about the history. They barely understand what happened in 1949 and the Civil War and the defeat of Chiang Kai-shek and all of it. They don't know much of that. Their understanding is that China is the evil doer. So, for example, they like to be told that the Chinese stole the technology from the West. The idea that American corporations exchanged technology for cheap labor and market access, which is what happened, they don't want that because that says that the corporations, with the support of the government, went to China, which is what happened. But they don't want that story. They want to be able to blame the Chinese. You could see it with President Trump. For the 4 years of his presidency, he explained that the tariffs were a punishment of the misbehavior of the Chinese. And he told the American people the Chinese would have to pay those tariffs. But of course, as a professor of economics, I had to explain to my students that tariffs are not paid by the Chinese. They're paid by Americans when they import. It's a tax called a tariff put on you by the American government. My students looked at me. They understood what I was telling them, but they had a really hard time because their president was telling them that the evil, bad Chinese are being punished because this story is very important so that the anger built up by 40 years of neoliberal globalization is focused on the Chinese and on immigrants. And the corporate leaders of America like that because they don't want to be the ones that get blamed. They don't. And so it's very helpful to them to blame immigrants and to blame the Chinese, even though they don't want to lose the Chinese connection. That issue, that's the issue here in the United States. Will we develop a political force that can successfully explain to the American working class what their problem is? Or will we continue to be governed by a Republican Party that blames immigrants more than Chinese, and a Democratic Party that blames Chinese more than immigrants? But both of them are perfectly happy to scapegoat both of them. And the Democrats add Russia, and the Republicans a little less on Russia, a little more on China. But don't be fooled by the details. And if you understand that, you won't be confused by the bizarre statements our politicians make or the political theater that they put on display. The reality is American capitalism is no longer the dominant capitalism in the world. It has to face that. The whole rest of the world is adjusting to that fact. China has to make a huge decision. The British Empire is over. The American Empire is declining. Will we now see a Chinese empire? Or will the Chinese be new and different in world history and say no more empires? Not Britain, not Rome, not Greece, not the United States, and not China. When Xi Jinping says, I want to create a multipolar world, this opens a whole new possibility. Remember, in the 20th century, the West tried the League of Nations. After World War II, the world tried the United Nations, but they did not succeed. The question is, might the Chinese lead the world into a genuinely multipolar world? I personally, I hope so.